Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim, and in today's episode, we're talking about Byron Murphy II, defensive tackle out of Texas. We're looking at him based on his production data profile and other statistical factors. And just some interesting little tidbit. Byron Murphy II lifted a team best squat of 455 pounds and ripped off 375 on the bench press. So we are going to be seeing what he does in Indy in terms of the bench press. That's going to be very exciting to kind of see what he does there because those are some pretty good numbers. I mean, they're not the best ever, but pretty decent numbers in terms of overall strength for him. Now, in terms of how I evaluate defensive tackles, I look at defensive market share data. What is market share data? Well, you take an individual statistic, you divide it by the team total, you do a positional peer ranking, so you compare what their market share scores were against their positional peers, and then you add in a factor of age to give you the defensive market share scores. In terms of Byron Murphy II, his market share data was kind of iffy. 30 percentile in terms of solo tackle production, 70 percentile in terms of sack production, and 60 percentile in terms of tackle for loss. So his production indicates that he's more so a in the backfield type defensive tackle than a defensive tackle that can kind of get it done in terms of other areas of the football field, in terms of being sideline to sideline. Most NFL All Pro, Pro Bowl defensive tackles were sideline to sideline. Byron Murphy II wasn't. So that's one big question mark is his production data doesn't really hit the All-Pro areas, the Pro Bowl areas, or the starter areas in terms of his overall production data, which is a concern. Another factor to kind of look at in terms of him is his other production marks. So looking at things like forced fumble market share, pass deflection market share, interception market share, which isn't really the biggest thing in the world, but it is fun to see defensive tackles getting interceptions. And when you look at his production, and the sample size has 1,729 defensive tackles since the 1989 NFL draft class, Byron Murphy doesn't really do well in terms of forced fumbles, doesn't really do well in terms of pass deflections, did well in terms of interceptions, but he didn't really hit all the areas you're looking at in terms of starter averages, Pro Bowl averages, and All Pro averages in terms of his overall production data. So that's again a bit of a concern. So when you look at him in terms of his solo tackles, sacks, and tackle for loss, he doesn't really get it done in terms of solo tackles. When you look at his forced fumbles, pass deflections, and interceptions, doesn't really get it done in terms of his forced fumbles or his pass deflections. In terms of adjusted production scores, this is a very interesting data point because this looks at the context of his production. Because I know a lot of what you guys are going to tell me. Jim, listen, he played at Texas, okay? You don't know what the heck you're talking about. Stop looking at data and look at the dang film. Look at the film. Look at it. Stop doing data. Stop doing it. That's what people are going to say. But here's the thing. Here's the thing, guys. Adjusted production scores take into account how good of a team they were on. They take into account the level of competition that they face in terms of the strength of schedule. They take into account how old the prospect was. And when you look at his adjusted production scores, it's okay. His age score is decent. He had a 94 percentile age score. His MSA score is 90 percentile, which is decent, but his pass score is 64 percentile. And when you look at the overall data points for most defensive tackles, he's just okay. I mean, his age does help him out a lot in terms of his overall profile, but he has concerns. There are some concerns and there's some positives, but I think when you don't look at things like forced fumbles and pass deflections, he looks a little bit better. But that is a concern, the fact that he wasn't really that productive. Now, in terms of prospects who tested similar to Byron Murphy II, I went back and looked at all those prospects to kind of pick out some guys who kind of stood out the most, some positives and negatives, and just, guys that tested similar to him. These are the guys that kind of went into that range. So the closest guys to him were guys like Angelo Blackson, Frank Ocom, Willie Henry, Alan Branch, Bo Allen, J.R. Sweezy, Robert Kindiche, And Chris Jones is probably like the high-end comparison. So his sack and tackle for loss production was in line with what Chris Jones did. But keep in mind, people, Chris Jones is a completely different type of defensive tackle. Chris Jones is more so a 3-4 defensive end, meaning he plays the 5 technique. Byron Murphy is probably going to be closer to like 6'1", 300 pounds, more so as like a 4-3 defensive tackle type. So they're different styles of defensive tackle. Just from a physical standpoint, they're different from that kind of perspective. So I do understand a lot of people are going to go, well, Jim, he's going to be Chris Jones. Can't you see? But again, most of the data doesn't really show him as that. He could be anywhere from Chris Jones or Robert Nkemdiche. You know, I don't think he's as bad as Robert Nkemdiche in terms of his solo tackle production, but that is the biggest concern with him, is he just wasn't really that productive based on his market share data, which goes to the overall outlook for him. And again, I wish him nothing but the best. I hope he ends up bucking the trends of his production data and goes on to become an outlier, because that'd be fantastic. Because again, inevitably, Chris Jones is an outlier in the data. So looking at Byron Murphy II, athleticism will be a major component in his projection. He profiles as like a backup to starter based on his overall profile. His biggest red flag is his solo tackle production, because most interior defensive linemen who dominate in the NFL have above average solo tackle production. It would be unusual for him to become a Pro Bowler with this data profile. So overall, that is Byron Murphy II in a nutshell. He has decent overall age factors and where he played. Those things do factor into his projection, but he wasn't a dominant player for where he played. And that's a concern. Why was he not more productive? If he is as great as they say he is, because there have been guys that have played on great football teams and put up the numbers that you would expect for them to put up at those great football teams. Byron Murphy II didn't do that. He didn't put up those elite numbers at that program. He was just a decent guy who contributed to the overall defense. So that is the main concern with Byron Murphy II. And again, I wish him nothing but the best. I hope he's successful in whatever he ends up doing. But I do think there's a major concern if you decide to take him in the first round in this particular draft class, because there are other defensive tackles, which I will be talking about on this show in the future, that have much better overall data and much better overall outlooks than Byron Murphy II. So with all that stuff out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching this channel. My name is Jim Coburn. You can check out my other work at Geometrics on X, or formerly known as Twitter. Jimetrics. You can also check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/jcoburn. And I will see you guys in the next one. Peace!